For those of you that haven't come across us before, our mission is to support and build the well-being of current and former bank workers. Now, the theme for today about the relationship between line managers and employee well-being is something I care very deeply about. It's something that I've spent a lot of time researching. And I believe that you can't have an organisational culture that is supportive of employee well-being without line managers playing a really key role in that. And what I'm going to look at today is how currently line managers aren't delivering on that, certainly not to the extent that they could. I'm going to take a look at some of the initiatives that businesses can take to make it easier for line managers to fulfill their well-being responsibilities. I'm going to give you an example of an initiative that was designed to improve line managers' soft skills, and I'll finally just touch on some of the things line managers need to do to support their own well-being, because it's clearly a complex and difficult job. So let's start with the line manager. You've probably all heard that phrase, people don't leave their job, they leave their manager. And whilst that seems a rather harsh black and white statement, I think there's enough kernel of truth in there for most of us to recognise and for the statement to resonate. And in fact, I'm going to give you quite a lot of research today about what it's telling us about line managers. And Towers Watson did some research in 2015 that found that 1/3 of UK workers were ready to leave their job because of a difficult relationship they had with their line manager. So, you know, serious issues. Now, what do the experts say? Well, about a year and a half ago, Professor Sir Carrie Cooper, who is a wellbeing expert in the UK, said of line managers that UK line managers today are unfit for purpose. Sad to say, but they simply don't have the interpersonal skills. And that was about a year and a half ago. A couple of weeks later, Dame Carol Black said of line managers, if I only had one thing to spend money on, just one initiative, it would be line manager training. And the idea that training line managers in people management is soft and fluffy is just wrong. So that gives you a sense of what the views are. What I'd like to do, in case you feel that we've somehow got it in for line managers, this is what the research tells us about line management in the UK at the moment. Again, you may be familiar with this statistic. In the UK economy is 20 percentage points less productive than the average for the G7. And you know, there's been a lot of coverage. Government are very concerned about lack of productivity in the UK economy. Line managers or poor line management is cited as the most likely reason why that productivity is so poor. Now, investors in people found that poor people management costs the UK economy 84 billion a year. So that's the impact on businesses. If you look at employees, Gallup found poor people management to be the #1 reason employees leave their job, bearing out what I was just telling you about Towers Watson. 1 in 2 people have quit their job at some point in their career to get away from their line manager. And if you look at why that might be, 60% of employees don't feel their manager shows any interest in them. 2/3 of employees don't feel appreciated for what they do in their day job. 60% of employees would stay in a job they're thinking of leaving if they had a caring boss. And, you know, in some ways more worryingly, there's a strong link between poor line management and the incidence of common mental health problems like stress, depression, and anxiety. So, turning again to business, and let's look at the impact on businesses when line managers do have good people management skills, but also what the consequences are when they don't. So good people management is associated with high levels of trust, sense of purpose, and job satisfaction among employees. It's also associated with better staff retention and higher levels of employee engagement. The thing about all of these things is they're linked to both higher levels of employee well-being, but also to better business performance and productivity. So clearly a good thing. Conversely, where line managers' people skills are poor, you have high levels of sickness absence and high levels of presenteeism. There's more likelihood of employees suffering serious health conditions like heart attacks. I've already mentioned the prevalence of common mental health problems, and it's also linked to high turnover of staff at a time, where we're in at the moment where organisations are trying to hold on to their best people, and also to lower productivity. Now, I wanted you to see that research because I thought probably, I don't know, I mean, you can tell me later, I think you probably wouldn't be surprised to find out those links exist. Because I think we all intuitively know we go the extra mile for a line manager that cares about us as an individual, that is supportive and communicative, that takes an interest in our personal and career development, that seems to care about us as an individual. In other words, somebody in whom we trust. So I think the implications are clear. Good people management skills are really critical, and not just to employee well-being, which they are, but also to delivering high performance and productivity for businesses. So if I'm saying that line managers are really important to business success and to employee well-being, what ought businesses to be doing in order to get it right? And the first thing I would say is they need to be recruiting the right people. And what we've seen happen in the UK is we've seen line managers' roles become more complex. They've taken on more people management responsibilities for things like disciplinaries, for things like conflict resolution in the workplace, for employee engagement, for motivating and inspiring their teams. And the list goes on. But what hasn't happened is recruitment practices haven't evolved and become more sophisticated in line with what we're looking for in line managers. And there are consequences to that, because what's happening is we continue to recruit line managers on the basis, usually, of their technical and functional skills. And that means a lot of line managers are recruited into roles, shoehorned into posts that they're not really suited for. And ultimately, that's going to let the line manager down because they're going to become frustrated in the role. But maybe even more importantly, it means you're depriving their subordinates of the kind of quality of line management that they really deserve. There was a study, I think the year before last, in which line managers were asked, why do you feel you were appointed to the role that you've got? And the two commonest responses were my longevity within the organisation and my success in my previous role. And these were all managers that had never taken on people management at all. So the issue is a serious one. There was some Gallup research that was done 2 years ago, I think, and they found that only 1 in 10 employees have the range of people skills and traits to be an effective line manager. And that seems like quite a harsh statistic. But if you think about what we expect of line managers, they're somehow supposed to be leaders, they're supposed to be coaches, mentors, friends, colleagues, sometimes even counsellors. Maybe that 1 in 10 figure isn't as unrealistic as it sounds. But I think, interestingly, that 1 in 10 figure isn't so far removed from the kinds of spans of control you see in a lot of organisations. And in fact, my sector is the banking sector, and if you go into a call centre, you'll often find people with spans of control of 15. So that being the case, it actually ought to be possible, if you get your recruitment right, to have a cohort of line managers that really do have the right skills. They're out there in the population, but the problem is we're not selecting the right people for those roles. And in fact, 82% of organisations are believed to be recruiting the wrong people into line management roles. So it's happening most of the time. And there was some research by the Institute of Leadership and Management, which they concluded it's becoming increasingly hard to find line managers with empathy and with high levels of emotional intelligence. And the problem with that is, as we move further into the 21st century, it's those skills which are going to be the most in demand, because what we're going to be seeing, and all the research points to this, more and more technical roles are going to become automated. So it will be those people with interpersonal skills that are going to be the most in demand. So what would I like to see? Well, the first thing is I'd like to see recruitment practices that actively tease out the quality of individuals' people management skills. And I mean by that to have psychometric tests, to have exacting interview questions that really test out people's capacity to deal with scenarios, the kind of which they're likely to face in a real organizational role. One of the most challenging stages in the development of line managers is when they take on people management responsibilities for the first time. And if I can take you back in time a bit, in 1996, I did my MSc on the experience of nurse managers who were taking on people roles for the first time. Actually, they weren't nurse managers at the point they were promoted, they became nurse managers. So essentially, they were being put into post on these incredibly stressful, busy wards where the people dynamics were really complicated. And I did this at one of the major London hospitals, and there wasn't a single one of those nurses was given any prior training before they stepped into that role. And it was a real pressure cooker environment. They found it immensely difficult, and most of them had a pretty grim experience. And you know, I heard some really sad and difficult stories. Now we move on nearly 20 years later, in fact 20 years later it is, and it doesn't appear that a great deal has changed because again, the Institute of Leadership and Management found that 4 out of 5 businesses continue to recruit people into line management roles without any prior training. So it is a really big issue. Now what I would like to see is all line managers receive good, strong people's training. And by that, I mean I would like you to have face-to-face components. I would like to see experiential elements in the training. So they deal with lots of demanding situations that really measure their ability to deal with difficult situations in the workplace with sensitivity. Because I think the problem is, if we continue to proceed on the way that we are, we're not really either supporting those line managers properly, and we're letting the business down as well. While we're at it, if we're going to be delivering training to new line managers, it may be worth looking at the business in general and seeing, are there people within the existing cohort of managers that may be deficient in their people skills, because there's no reason why they couldn't be given the opportunity to do some training too, because there seems to be a need out there. And whilst we're at it, businesses are spending money on management development, even in the more straitened times that we have now. There's still lots of money going into management development. And I would like to see people skills feature in that management development in the same way that we see money spent on things like budgetary planning and project management, because I think that's what we deserve. Now, despite everything I've said so far, we've got to be careful here not to demonize line managers, because there are actually plenty out there who do have natural leadership skills, who are able to engage with and manage people well, but they do need an organizational environment that supports them in doing that. And the problem is, lots of the time, that isn't in place. The organizational culture has a very different set of priorities, and I think we need to look at that. Has anybody come across a report, Mental Health at Work, that was published about two or 3 weeks ago by Business in the Community? If you haven't, it's a very interesting paper. It does focus on the role of the line manager. But what I found interesting in there, there's absolutely masses of useful data and stats in there, but one of the findings was that 63% of those line managers felt on a daily basis, or at least some of the time, they were having to put corporate interests over the well-being needs of their people. So there is, you know, we've been focusing on the line manager, but it is also about the business. The businesses have a really key role to play here. It's not all down to the line managers. Business need to be sending out the right signals to line managers to utilize the right kind of behaviors and management styles, but maybe importantly, to allow them the time to do that. I think, I'm trying to think of the particular paper I was looking at, but it was suggested that 90% of line managers do see employee well-being as their responsibility. But it needs that facilitative organisational culture to make that difference. So I think one of the problems is that businesses inevitably are concentrating on delivery on task. And they reward people because of delivery on task. And if that's the case, then it's not very surprising that line managers focus on that rather than, on the people responsibilities. Now, there's a kind of irony there, I think, because if line managers don't deal with build relationships with their teams, they're actually putting at risk the very supportive team relationship on which meeting those business objectives, I think, really depends. What I would like to see is line managers' well-being responsibilities made properly part of, or made explicit in things like job descriptions. And I think they're always there in a very loose way, or they're implicit, but I think really make them explicit so that line managers themselves see employee well-being as central to rather than peripheral to what they're doing. And I think what you could also do, you could use performance review to reinforce this so that you have well-being objectives featuring in performance review and have the businesses measure people's performance against those objectives every bit as seriously as they do with the more standard hard-nosed business objectives. I suppose what I'd also like to see is line managers' responsibilities extended to recognise their role in relation to any well-being strategies and programs that businesses have. I'm sure you're aware, you probably see it in your own organisations, most businesses at least have well-being programs in place. Many have much more than that. Increasingly, businesses are developing well-being strategies. I think the problem is that a lot of the time, well-being programs are seen as the exclusive preserve either of HR or occupational health. And if they're going to be really successful, you have to move beyond that. If they become ghettoized as an HR responsibility, then they're never going to have the impact that they need. So I think lots of different parts of the business have a role to play in well-being. Certainly business leaders in championing the well-being programs, but I think the line managers are really critical. They have a role in raising awareness of programs. They need to be encouraging their uptake by their employees, and also they should be ideally modelling those well-being responsibilities themselves. So they're the kind of steps that I'd like to see happening more in UK businesses if the very large investment that is happening at the moment, and it's been estimated that businesses, this is a worldwide figure, not UK specific, but businesses are spending 40 billion on wellbeing programs, which is obviously a massive sum of money. And we need to be getting more impact out of them. So moving on from this, I said I was going to give you an example of an initiative designed to improve line managers' soft skills. Why am I doing that? It's because I think there's an assumption out there, or not everywhere, but held by some people, that good people management is something that is part of somebody's personality trait. It's not something that can be taught. And I don't buy that. I think there are clearly line managers out there who are naturally empathic, and they bring that to their management style. It's probably, they don't even probably think about it. It's just part of the way that they behave. But for those that aren't naturally empathic, who have to work on things, it's perfectly possible to draw attention to behaviours and management styles that do support employee well-being. And, you know, I think that's what we were trying to do with this particular initiative, to try and skill up line managers. Now, what it was, what I'm referring to, is a training programme that my organisation, Bankworkers Charity, developed with the mental health charity Mind. And what we were trying to do was to develop a training program that reduced the number of circumstances when employees came to talk to their manager with a mental health problem, and that line manager didn't know what to do with it. And I'll give you a little bit of detail about that in a moment, but we were wanting to develop those line managers' confidence and skills so that no employee within any of the banks that we work with ever had a negative experience when they said, look, I've got to tell you something, I'm suffering with depression. Before I do that, if I can just tell you briefly about an experience that I had in one of the major banks that we work with. Just bear with me a sec. What happened was, I went to an event, a really brilliant event organised by one of their diversity and inclusion networks on mental health in the workplace. It was fantastically well done. It was a very large number of people attending. I hadn't appreciated it was becoming such a big issue in the bank. But they had a series of excellent speakers, but at the end it came to question and answer. And one of the participants in the meeting put their hand up and said, look, I'm a line manager, and I've had a number of occasions over the years where I've been concerned about the mental health of members of my team. And I've never said anything because I was worried that I didn't know what to say and I might end up saying the wrong thing and making the situation worse. And I feel really terrible about that. What do you say? And they were putting that out to the panel. I could see the kind of anxiety on the panel because I don't think they quite knew how to answer it. But the idea of our training was to prevent situations like that in any of the banks that we work with, so that we were able to give line managers a good understanding of basic mental health issues that enabled them to not be frightened, to not run a mile, and also the right language and the skills and the sensitivity to be able to give that employee a positive experience. Now, just to say a little bit more about that around mental health in the workplace and the line manager. The line manager is usually the first organisational touch point for anybody that's struggling with a mental health problem. So in that first conversation, if that line manager handles the situation well, then that employee is likely, well, first of all, to be really appreciative, but they're likely to feel well supported by the line manager. They're much less likely to go off sick, and they'll probably end up, whether it's internally or externally, getting the kind of support that they need with whatever the issue is that they've raised. But when line managers handle the problem well, usually because they don't understand the mental health issues, or they don't have the interpersonal skills to handle the conversation well, or they just don't have the confidence, then not only does it go badly for the individual, but it's going badly for the business too, and probably for that individual's relationship with their line manager. I think the key here is line managers don't need to be experts in mental health. They're not counsellors. They shouldn't be expected to be performing like counsellors. But I think in many organisations, mental health is mythologized as something horribly complicated, something that can only be understood and addressed by the professionals. And what that does is it undermines line managers. It makes them feel unqualified and unconfident in addressing situations when they arise in their teams. But actually, the line manager has a really vital role to play with the right kind of support at the right time. And really, that's what this program was designed to give them. Now, I haven't got time to go into the detail here, but what I'm going to do is just tell you about some of the basic content of that training. Essentially, and I think this is really important, there are lots of mental health training out there that are designed to upskill line managers in awareness terms, but there are very few that actually try and change their behaviours to give them the skills to do things differently. And that's what we set out to do. So when we sat down with Mind, we realised very quickly it wasn't going to happen with a one-off intervention. How many times have you been to courses that you thought were really good, and you come away and you're thinking about it for a day or so afterwards, but then the PowerPoint goes in somewhere into the millions of PowerPoints in your computer and you never look at it again. And you remember 6 months down the line, didn't I do some training on that once? It was quite good, but I can't remember. The idea was that this would unfold over time. So it basically consisted of 2 half days of face-to-face training with somebody who was both a trainer but somebody who'd had mental health issues themselves that could draw on their own experience. And those 2 half days were firstly to raise awareness, but the second one was much more the experiential end, to give line managers the opportunity to practice what they were learning. That was then followed up, and I'll show you some examples of it, by 12 monthly modules. So this whole training was 12 months to completion. But in that time, to make sure that these modules weren't too onerous, each one takes about 45 minutes to complete. But the line managers were given a scenario before they started the training, like a member of your team comes to you and says, they've just been diagnosed with depression. What do you do? What do you say? What support do you make available? And there's a video inside one of those modules that explains how to do it in best practice, so they compare their own approach to it against what is recommended by Mind as the best way to deal with that particular scenario. So that was the model for it. It's just been evaluated by the CIPD. We wanted the CIPD to do it because they understand the workplace better than the purely research-based organisation, but they nevertheless have really strong research skills. That report's just come out. We're really encouraged by what it's found. And I can only give you a few brief highlights, but essentially, for the line managers that did the face-to-face training at the beginning, they were evaluated after 6 months. They found that their knowledge of mental health, 99% of them had found their knowledge of mental health had improved. We were a little bit worried about those digital modules. Would people stick with them? They did. 85% of the line managers said they'd applied the learning from those digital modules in their day jobs. And then at the 6-month stage, the number of line managers who felt confident in dealing with any mental health problems that arose in their teams, it jumped from 57% at the beginning of the training, because they were all pre-questioned before the training started. That had leapt to 94% by the end. And I suppose one thing that I was really excited by in that as a consequence of that training, and it relates to the wider issue that we're talking about today, was that one of the line managers said, you know something, this training has transformed how I approach my performance reviews. And I think we hadn't appreciated that. We were seeking to deal with mental health, but not really thinking through that the fact that people are better at dealing with those kind of sensitive situations about mental health extend to lots of other things. The underlying skill set that allows somebody to deal well with somebody who's under high levels of stress aren't actually any different from the skills needed to console somebody that's had a bereavement, or to deal with a conflict in the workplace, or, as this line manager said, to deal much better with their performance reviews. Now, the final thing, and I didn't say this earlier on, was that when we asked CIPD to do the evaluation, we asked them not just to look at the line managers, but to look for any improvement in this experience of the line manager's subordinates. So they also became part of the research project. And what was really exciting was where those line managers had experienced an improvement in their ability to manage mental health problems, the employees that worked to that line manager saw improvement across a whole range of workplace experiences, and their own mental health was better, their job satisfaction was better, the extent to which they felt the organisation was a stressful place to be had improved, and even their ability to talk about mental health issues was much better than it had been. The one thing that we asked CIPD to do that we couldn't demonstrate anything significant on was whether it had any impact on sickness absence levels. Partly the reason we couldn't establish a linkage was different banks, and they were major banks. We're talking about TSB, the Bank of England, Barclays, Lloyds, but they all do their sickness absence data in different ways, so it wasn't comparable. It would have been nice to be able to demonstrate ROI, but unfortunately that was beyond us. So, as I say, I wanted to tell you about that just because, you know, the evidence is there that this training has made a massive difference to those line managers' interpersonal skills. And that's evidence not just on the improvement that we were seeing in the research, but also in their own comments about the training. So finally, I said I wanted to touch on the well-being of line managers. I think the thing with line managers is that in some ways, they have quite a thankless task. It's kind of the squeezed middle, isn't it? They've got their responsibility for their own teams and all the expectations and the demands coming from below, but they're having to deal, of course, with the pressures from their senior managers in the organisation, all of the things that they have to do that aren't about team management. They're also, of course, responsible for the performance of their bit of the business. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that line managers are likely to have personal lives every bit as complex and demanding as the people whose well-being they're expected to support. So it is really important that line managers look after their own well-being, and I think it's something that doesn't happen often enough. It's the one thing that goes out the window when workloads are going through the roof, that they don't find the time to devote to it. So these are just some of the things that we found to be really effective in supporting line manager well-being. And you know, some of them are fairly obvious. Getting the work-life balance right, really important. You know, try not to work late too often. We all do it from time to time, but for it not to become a pattern. Creating clear boundaries between work and home so that there's not so much spillage. I know, again, it's very hard with digital technology, makes it very hard to fit everything into the day at work. I personally have a to-do list that I do at the end of each day, just because I had too many instances where I was waking in the middle of the night and finding I was in a panic about something that I'd completely forgotten about. You make it less risk of that. Something else that I do personally, using time to commute to wind down. So I try not to think about work on the way in. I read a book. I always have a book with me. But you know, these things are different for everybody. I'm not saying everybody should be involved in this. And I don't mean just line managers. I think these are things it makes sense for anybody to be doing, because the workplace has become such a demanding, stressful environment today. To ask for help if you're struggling, if workloads become too much, take the opportunity to discuss it with your manager. I think peer support from other line managers is really important. You know, even if it's just somewhere to vent when everything's getting too much, I think really important. Confiding, well, we've said that, confiding in people's trust. Eating well and taking exercise seems blatantly obvious, but it's again one of the things that tends to slip off the list when everything's really busy. And I think finally, just to be clear about the stress coping strategies that work for you. Again, I'm speaking at a personal level. I love going for walks in the countryside. I'm an avid bird watcher, and that gets me out. When I'm doing those things, I don't think about work at all. If the weather's rubbish, then I'm probably sitting at home listening to music. I might go for a run. But I think it doesn't really matter what you do. It's important to know which things work for you that will take the heat off when things become really bad.